everybody. All right, as promised, I am sort of on a theme kick right now, and we're moving on to through threads because I've mentioned them a couple of times, and it makes sense to me to cluster all of these things together as we're thinking through all the different ways that theme informs our writing. And so on Thursday, I had spoken about how theme impacts your social media and largely your author platform. And today I want to discuss through threads specifically. Through threads really are recurring elements that show up in your memoir. I don't know. I'm sure there is. I was going to say, like, is there an equivalent in fiction? Probably. But in memoir, they're kind of important insofar as they circle your themes. And so since we've talked specifically last week about why themes are important and how they can be a guiding light or a sort of like a containment way of thinking about containing your work, through threads are more poetic, I guess I would say, and more of a device that you can use. And it's not necessary, but it is very satisfying. And so interestingly, I had the opportunity to interview Maggie Smith. I mentioned a few weeks ago how much I loved her book called You Could Make This Place Beautiful. And so Grant and I brought her onto the podcast. That podcast is going to be airing tomorrow. So I'm going to give you a little sneak peek of her answer to my question, or rather Grant's question specifically about through threads. But I've always said in teaching about through threads that the reason I like them is because they're satisfying. And I loved that Maggie said that as well. It was very validating. And I was like, oh, cool, we're speaking the same language. And so sometimes really that's a purpose, for things like metaphors and symbols and ideas, is just to give the reader satisfaction. And so through threads are recurring ideas. They're usually things that are ideas, metaphors, symbols. In the class, 6-month class that Linda Joy and I teach, the example I most use because it's the most concrete and helps people to truly understand it is The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls, because The Glass Castle, it's sort of a perfect example of how through thread is used, because The Glass Castle is the title of the book, but it also is this recurring thematic element that Jeanette Walls refers to probably 6 or 7 times throughout the book. And The Glass Castle is a promise from her father, that someday they will live in a glass castle. And of course, it's also a false promise. It's also serves as a disappointment because it never happens and it never was going to happen. But the fact that she mentions it and that she weaves it throughout is the part that makes it a recurring element. Now, heavy is another example that I want to give, because Kiese Layman in the book Heavy uses heavy as a symbol. He uses it as a metaphor. He uses it as a double entendre. Heavy means his weight, of course. That's the most obvious. He's a heavy set guy. And he also loses a lot of weight in the book at one point, so he examines his weight and his presence. And so much of that book is about being in his body and what it feels like to be in a heavy body. But there's also the heaviness of the topic, heaviness of being a Black man in America. And so if you look at that book and think about it through the lens of the title and the symbol and what heavy means, it's got a lot of multi-layeredness to it, which I love. And also heavy itself, the idea, the symbol, the concept serves as a through thread in that book. Maggie specifically, I was going to see if I could share my screen, because I thought I would give you a sneak peek if I can make this work to give you a little taste. We're going to see if this functions or not, because when Grant asks her about the recurring elements, and what I want to say about Maggie's book specifically is that for those of you who have read it, she has a lot of recurring elements. She uses the idea of Russian nesting dolls to refer to our many selves. And she uses that concept more than once and to great effect. She also uses the idea of a boat. She says that she and her family are on a boat, and the boat kind of changes throughout the book. She's cast away. She's sort of at sea. She's on her own in the beginning with her husband, and then the children are there and the whole family is on a boat. And then at the end, she's on the boat only with her children. And so she uses this idea, again, it's a poetic metaphor. But because we can, I'm just going to share about a minute of Maggie's answer because I think it's supplemental and awesome. And then you can listen to the whole interview tomorrow.
Because you use a lot of effective metaphors and often come back to them multiple times, like the idea of being out on a boat with your family and how this experience changes when it's just you and your ex-husband, and then you as a couple with your kids, and then post-divorce. So I was wondering if you can, talk more about the importance of these recurring elements, these recurring questions, which you also do. And I guess, like, what do you think they offer readers through that, recurrence, which is a poetic device as well?
It is. I mean, I think when I'm writing a book of poems, whenever I have a series, and every book of mine, every poetry book of mine has at least one series in it, all poems that kind of belong together, and they never live together in the book. And I remember Beth Ann Fennelly asking me once, I think it was after Good Bones was published, she said, why do you have these series, but none of them are clustered together? Like, you have 4 sections in this book, but all of the series are spread out. They don't live side by side. And I was like, oh, I don't like that. Like, I actually don't like it in a book of poems when all of the poems that are like each other live side by side. It feels too monotonous to me. I prefer the breadcrumb trail model where you get a bit of something and then a little bit later you get another bit of it and you get that, like, oh, I know what that is. And so you get this moment of familiarity. And for a reader, as a reader, I find that really satisfying. I like when I'm getting signposts. It's almost like, oh, you're going the right way. Like, you're reading this correctly, as opposed to just being inundated and having sort of a compartmentalized structure and then moving on to, like, the next kind of poem or kind of story. And so it's natural for me to write repeating things and spread them out. That's just how I build books.
There you go. That's kind of a treat because Maggie is speaking to through threads there. When you're talking about these recurring elements that you build into your book, you might not know what those things are yet. Okay, that's perfectly fine. Just be on the lookout for them. What are things that are recurring and showing up for you? What are ideas and metaphors and concepts and symbols and things that are maybe naturally recurring in your work, things that you're drawn to? You might use something, to describe something, like Maggie used the nesting dolls, and then just use them again in a different form. But I loved what she said because it is about familiarity and the reader going, oh my gosh, yes, we talked about that earlier, and now we're circling back to it again. And it is a poetic way of thinking about using these kinds of devices in your memoir. So if some of this feels confusing and you're like, I'm not exactly sure what you mean, I would highly recommend reading Maggie's book because you'll see the various ways that she does that. Read Heavy, read The Glass Castle. There are lots and lots of books that do this, and then you can start to pay attention to it yourself, maybe even highlight the places where they show up and let it metabolize, what exactly it means to have through threads in your memoir. So for the time being, I just recommend paying attention to metaphors, symbols, concepts, ideas, maybe jot them down or even put them in a different color text when they show up for your own sake, just to be paying attention. And happy writing, everybody. Thank you.